Well, hi there. I'm Joan Wiedeger, and welcome back to Her Shrink Ray Eye. I want to start with something I've been thinking about for a while. Part of what inspired this episode was a movie I watched a few months ago called Stop Motion. What stayed with me about that film was the disturbing way it used handmade figures, scene design, and controlled movements to make familiar miniature forms feel strange. It took materials, spaces, and methods that are already very close to the world many of us work in and made them feel unsettling in a way I couldn't quite shake. That got me thinking about how many miniature artists may know that feeling in their own work, because sometimes a piece starts to feel stranger than any one decision can explain. Miniatures are not always as reassuring as they first appear. They can be beautiful, skillful, and expressive, but they can also disturb us in ways that are hard to explain, not because they're surreal and not because of dark subject matter, but because something in the miniature comes close to feeling natural without quite getting there. A miniature face may look almost normal until the gaze does not quite match the angle of the head. A figure may seem to be moving, but the body does not seem to carry its own weight. Or think of a child's room. It may look perfectly ordinary until you realize it feels arranged for life without containing any sign of it. That is the kind of unease I mean here, not theatrical horror, but the feeling that something is nearly right and still wrong. In miniature art, we spend a great deal of time thinking about how to make small things feel believable. We talk about realism, accuracy, smooth blends, proper scale, and all the other measurable aspects of our craft. And those conversations matter because technical skill is important. But there is another response that can appear before we can explain it, when a piece is readable and convincing, and yet still makes you hesitate. People have been trying for a long time to describe why certain almost familiar things make us uneasy. Some of you will know the modern version of this idea through the Uncanny Valley in robotics and computer animation. But the idea itself is older and more complicated than the graph people often point to online. At its simplest, the uncanny is the feeling that something is both familiar and unsettling at the same time. And miniatures are especially relevant here because they so often ask us to see something as both lifelike and as an object at the same time. That feeling of unease has a long history behind it. In 1906, the psychologist Ernst Jentsch argued that the uncanny arises from uncertainty, especially uncertainty about what kind of thing we're looking at. His emphasis was not mainly on horror, it was on the discomfort that appears when the mind cannot easily classify what it sees. Is it alive or inanimate, human or object, empty or inhabited? Jentsch's point was that uncertainty itself can be disturbing. A little over a decade later, Freud approached the uncanny somewhat differently. For him, the uncanny was not simply the unfamiliar, it was the strangely familiar, something that ought to fit inside our sense of the world, and yet it doesn't. Those are not exactly the same claims, but I think miniature artists can use both of them. Jentsch helps explain the unease of category confusion. Freud helps explain why the disturbance is often stronger when the object or scene feels close to home, close to childhood, close to something we know. For miniature artists, dolls and figurines are often a more useful bridge than robots are to this idea of the uncanny. A doll presents us with a humanoid body and face, but one that is clearly inanimate. It invites recognition without fully confirming it. That tension between person and object helps explain why dolls, mannequins, and highly lifelike small figures can feel uncanny. Ventriloquist dolls are an especially vivid example because their whole purpose is to simulate aliveness while remaining unmistakably an object. That is not a side issue. It points towards one of the deeper tensions in miniature art as well. A miniature figure asks us to hold two realities at once. We know it's paint, resin, putty, or plastic, but we are also being asked to view it as a body and not just a material. The uncanny can emerge when those two recognitions stop aligning and begin to work against each other. Modern research does not point to one single cause of the uncanny, but it does support parts of the older discussion. Work on the uncanny valley suggests that unease often increases not from human likeness alone, but when something looks human while other cues do not support that impression. In other words, the problem is often not that something is too realistic. It's that realism has been established strongly enough that the remaining inconsistency becomes more noticeable and more disturbing. Work on how we read movements also suggests that when appearance and movement do not match the predictions the mind makes about bodies, the result can feel wrong in a particularly immediate way. That matters for miniatures because our response to them is never purely optical. We are also reading implied motion, implied weight, implied life. And that to me is where this episode really starts. Not with robots or with a graph on the internet, but with the specific question of why small, handmade scenes can feel so psychologically charged. Miniatures are already strange objects when you think about them closely. They are worlds and things at the same time. They are intimate and artificial at the same time. They invite care, scrutiny, and imaginative projection. They ask us to approach them closely, often at the scale of the face, the hand, the room, the threshold. In that sense, miniature art may be especially well suited to the uncanny because it depends from the start on a very delicate balance between belief and the fact that it is still a made thing. But an idea like this is only useful if it helps us see where the feeling actually comes from in miniature work. So let's stay close to the miniature itself for a moment. Where does this happen really? Faces are one of the clearest places it happens. Human beings are highly sensitive to facial structure, gaze, and expression. We do not look at a face for very long as if it were just a shape. We begin reading it for mind and mood, intention, and presence. A miniature face can trigger that process immediately, especially when it is carefully painted and clearly meant to read as human. But the face can also become uncanny very quickly when those signals stop agreeing. The gaze may not align with the position of the head. The eyes may be too symmetrical, too fixed. Maybe they're too sharply outlined against a softer treatment everywhere else. The expression may imply emotion without fully settling into one. In those cases, what becomes unsettling is not merely how the face is painted. It's the failure of the face to become fully legible as a human face. Studies of artificial and doll-like faces support this general pattern. Realism by itself is not always the issue. Realism combined with one feature that departs from the rest of the system can be enough to produce eeriness. Skin behaves similarly. Real skin carries tiny variations in translucency, tone, and surface irregularity. When miniature skin becomes too even, too smooth, or too consistent, it may still read as skillful, but it can begin to feel less like skin and more like a substitute for skin. Not always and not in every style, but in work that is clearly trying to create a lifelike presence, those small regularities can drift towards the familiar but unfamiliar. The uncanny can also appear in the body. We are very good at reading movement from stillness. Give us a figure mid-step, mid-reach, mid-turn, or mid-fall even, and we do not merely observe the arrangement of limbs, we infer the movement that led into that position and the movement that should follow from it. This is one reason some miniatures feel alive and others do not. A pose may be dynamic in design and still fail to feel like it's possible as a natural movement of the body. The feet may touch down correctly, but the weight does not seem to travel through them. A hand may reach convincingly in space, but the shoulder, rib cage, or torso does not participate in the action. A body can be turned in a way the balance does not actually support. That can create a very particular kind of unease because the figure is offering the signs of movement without the deeper logic of movement. Research on biological motion and action prediction helps explain why such inconsistencies matter. We do not simply see posture, we read expected action through it. When the expected action fails to materialize in the body, something feels wrong before we are able to name why. Materials can also be a part of the uncanny. Real surfaces age, stain, oxidize, gather dust, chip, and erode according to use and their environment. Miniature artists often know this intuitively, which is why material behavior is such a large part of convincing work. Once the eye begins to trust a scene, it also becomes more demanding of that logic. Rust cannot merely decorate. Dust doesn't just sit everywhere equally. Wear cannot simply be attractive. Those elements should seem caused by something. A beautifully painted surface can still produce subtle disbelief if the weathering reads as pattern rather than history. That does not always create the uncanny in the strongest sense, but it can create the kind of perceptual friction that makes a scene feel unstable. Scale is another major source of tension. One of the most fascinating things about miniature work is that scale is never communicated by size alone. It's communicated by the relationship among dozens of cues: texture, edge thickness, particle size, depth, shadow behavior, wear patterns, object spacing, and surface finish. When those cues support one another, the illusion can be remarkably strong. But when even one or two of them drift out of alignment, the scene may begin to feel subtly unstable. Oversized texture can make an object seem toy-like, even when its proportions are correct. Edge thickness on armor, machinery, or architectural detail can imply a different scale than the rest of the scene is trying to establish. Shadows can be physically plausible in one sense and still wrong for the implied scale. What makes this difficult is that each element may look acceptable in isolation. The problem often emerges only when the viewer holds them all together as one world. The uncanny is not limited to figures and faces. Rooms can be uncanny too, especially when they are domestic, familiar, and still. A dollhouse interior, a child's bedroom, maybe a kitchen, a hallway. These are spaces saturated with ordinary expectation. We know how they are supposed to feel. We know what kinds of life they imply. That is part of why miniature interiors can become so psychologically charged. When a room is arranged for use and yet feels untouched by actual living, the effect can be stronger than simple emptiness. It can feel like absence and more like withdrawal. A chair can be pulled back, but no one's there. A bed is made too neatly. A lamp casts light into a room that seems to have no sign of occupation in it. The space is coherent, but it does not feel inhabited. Theory that emphasizes how the familiar becomes strange helps explain uncanny responses to miniatures. The disturbing quality is not simply that the room is empty. It's that the room belongs to a category that should feel intimate, safe, ordinary, and human. And instead, it begins to feel sealed off from use or left behind by life itself. Work on the uncanny and domestic interiors and on dolls' houses points in this direction too. Miniature interiors are often culturally loaded with ideas of home, care, childhood, and memory, which means their disturbance is rarely only visual. It's also symbolic and emotional. At this point, I think it's worth saying something more specific. The uncanny in miniatures is not just a smaller version of the uncanny in other art forms. Miniatures have some structural qualities that make them especially well suited for it. First, miniatures compress the distance between object and world. A full-scale room can simply be a room. A miniature room is always both a room and an object under inspection. A full-scale person can simply be a person. A miniature figure is always both an impression of a person and a thing made by hand. That double status is part of the medium's power, but it's also part of its unease. Miniatures ask us to project life into what we fully know is non-living matter, while never quite allowing us to forget the matter itself. Second, miniatures invite very close looking. You do not usually stand at intimate face-reading distance from a real building, but you do from a small room. You do from a tiny face. You do from a hand the size of a fingernail. That intensity of scrutiny magnifies discrepancies that might pass unnoticed elsewhere. It also makes the encounter feel private, almost conspiratorial. The viewer is pulled inward, closer than normal, into an object that is already asking for belief. And third, miniatures carry cultural baggage that larger realism often does not carry in the same way. Dolls, dollhouses, nursery objects, mannequins, puppets. These are not neutral cultural forms. They are tied to childhood, imitation, nurture, display, and sometimes death. That is one reason the uncanny in miniature work can feel so old, so immediate, and so disproportionately strong. The uncanny is not only something produced by inaccuracies in the work, it's emerging from a medium that already lives very close to old anxieties about animation, substitution, and the unstable boundary between life and object. This helps explain what is often called the dangerous middle zone. The uncanny frequently appears when a miniature asks to be read as believable, but not all of its signals support that belief equally. Work that is clearly stylized usually establishes different terms. The viewer accepts exaggeration as part of the contract. Work that is powerfully convincing can also avoid this particular kind of unease because its cues support one another strongly enough to sustain the illusion. But the zone in between is treacherous. That is where objecthood and lifelikeness press hardest against each other. That is where the viewer begins to believe and then hesitates. And that hesitation can be more disturbing than either obvious artifice or full illusion. That broader logic is close to the modern uncanny valley, even if miniature art does not map neatly onto the graph itself. So far, I have mostly been talking about the uncanny as something that happens to a work or happens in the viewer. But it can also be something an artist chooses to work with deliberately. That matters because not every unsettling effect is a mistake. In film, painting, literature, and installation art, discomfort has long been used not just to shock, but to hold attention, deepen ambiguity, and create emotional complexity. The uncanny is especially powerful because it does not rely on blunt force. It works by disturbing what is already recognizable. It lets the artist stay near the familiar while changing the emotional charge of the familiar. Miniature art is capable of that too, even if hobby dialogue often talks more easily about realism than about unease. Some of the most memorable small-scale scenes do not ask us simply to admire them. They ask us to remain with them. They hold us in that difficult state where everything is visible, and yet the scene does not give itself away entirely. There are already artists working in this territory. You see it in surreal dioramas where scale hierarchy is uncertain. You see it in horror pieces where the human form is only slightly displaced rather than monstrously altered. You see it in domestic scenes where order itself begins to feel oppressive. You see it in pieces where the stillness is so complete that it begins to suggest aftermath, anticipation, or suspended time. In work like that, the artist is not failing to remove tension. The artist is deciding how much tension to preserve. Unintentional conflicts in anatomy, scale, lighting, or material logic can weaken a piece because they scatter the work's meaning. Intentional instability does something else. It concentrates the viewer's attention. A slight proportion shift can make a body feel subtly wrong without becoming caricature. A too still room can become more psychologically charged than an obviously chaotic one. A tiny discrepancy in lighting or depth can make a space feel dreamlike without tipping into fantasy. A figure caught a fraction too early or too late in an action can feel haunted by its own incompletion. And here I think miniature artists may have an advantage. because the medium is already built on compression, substitution, and intimate looking. It does not take much to alter the emotional temperature of a scene. A small deviation can carry a great deal. Miniatures are not just exercises in technical skill. They are also things we respond to perceptually, emotionally, and sometimes through memory. The uncanny can be a sign that a miniature is doing more than simply describing a place or figure. A room that feels slightly too still, a figure whose gaze seems fixed on nothing in the scene, or a surface that suggests time without fully explaining what happened there can all create that effect. The miniature is not only showing us something, it's also shaping how we respond to it. For artists interested in psychological storytelling, surreal environments, or emotionally charged small-scale scenes, that gives them a lot to work with. Not every piece aims for this, but when you do want the viewer to pause, look twice, and feel that slight shift in their footing, the uncanny becomes something that you can use deliberately. Whenever we talk about something this theoretical, there is always a danger of letting it drift too far from practice. So I want to bring it back down to the bench because that is where these decisions actually happen. One of the most useful things an artist can do is learn to trust that first moment of hesitation. Not to panic, not to repaint automatically, but to notice it. If you find yourself looking at a figure and feeling a subtle resistance to it, that response is often worth examining closely. Sometimes the issue is structural, the weight does not travel through the stance, the eyes are not actually focused where the head implies. Maybe the skin is too even for the kind of realism the face is otherwise asking for. The weathering could be attractive, but not believable. Maybe the room is beautifully arranged, but somehow airless. In those cases, discomfort is useful because it points towards a place where the work is making two incompatible claims at once. But not always. Sometimes the disturbance is doing real artistic work. It may be strengthening the atmosphere. It may be preserving ambiguity that the piece depends on. It may be making the viewer feel that the scene exists slightly outside ordinary time. The question is not whether the work is perfectly comfortable. The question is whether the discomfort belongs there. That is a very different standard. The practical habits that help here are often simple. Step away and come back. Change the viewing distance. Photograph the piece. Look at it in a mirror. And perhaps most useful of all is asking a different set of questions than we usually do. Does the scene hold together? Does the eye move smoothly through it? Does the implied motion feel supported? Do the materials behave the way the viewer expects them to behave? And if the piece is an interior or enclosed scene, does it feel inhabited in the way you intend? Or does it feel sealed, suspended, or strangely emptied out? We do not always think to ask those questions, but they can often lead to useful adjustments. Over time, many artists develop an internal feel for this. You begin to sense when a piece has locked into place. There is a kind of exhale that happens when everything finally comes together. And just as importantly, you begin to recognize when that exhale does not come. Neither state is automatically good or bad. What matters is whether the result matches what you intend the viewer to experience. One of the things that continues to fascinate me about miniature work is how sensitive we remain to very small visual cues, even at this scale. We are not just looking at tiny objects. We are often, without fully realizing it, checking weight, balance, surface behavior, implied motion, and space, and asking whether the small world in front of us feels like something that could really exist. Most of the time, a miniature feels convincing because the cues within it support one another closely enough that we accept what we are seeing without much resistance. But sometimes that does not happen. There is a slight hesitation, a moment where you linger without quite knowing why, because something in the scene seems to be working against itself. That space, uncomfortable as it can be, tells us something important. A shift in the eyes, a pose that does not fully support itself, a room that feels arranged for life but not inhabited by it. Any of those things can change the emotional temperature of what we're looking at. And that means the uncanny is not a side topic. It's one of the clearest ways to understand how miniature work can move beyond competence alone and become psychologically alive. Not because every uncanny effect is desirable, and not because every hesitation in front of a miniature is profound, but because those moments reveal something important about how miniature art works in the first place. They show us that this is not only a medium of accuracy or finish, it's also a medium of belief, projection, substitution, intimacy, and doubt. It's about recognizing that a small amount of instability can be part of what makes a miniature compelling, because not every piece needs to let us feel completely comfortable with it. Some of them are more interesting when they refuse to. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a fellow hobbyist. Subscribe, follow, or simply take a little time to listen when you can. I appreciate every person who joins me here. I'll be right here with my lamp on, brush in hand, story waiting. Before I sign off today, I want to thank the Shepherd Payne Education Fund for their support of this podcast and their commitment to education in the miniature arts. Until next time, keep your hands steady, see clearly, not obediently, and keep your story your own. Thanks for listening.